If you have Chinese ancestry, something extraordinary lives inside your DNA. Scientists have now confirmed that the genetic signature carried by hundreds of millions of Han Chinese today is essentially identical to people who farmed the Yellow River Basin 7,000 years ago. No other major civilization on Earth can claim that kind of continuity. None. Think about what that actually means. While empires rose and fell, while populations were replaced and conquered and scattered across continents, while the people of Egypt became Arabs, and the people of Rome became Italians, and the people of Mesopotamia became something altogether unrecognizable from their ancient ancestors, the descendants of the Yellow River held on, not just culturally, not just linguistically, genetically, in their blood, in their cells, in the very strands of DNA that science can now read like a book written before the invention of writing itself. This is one of the most astonishing discoveries in the history of human genetics, and it deserves to be told in full. This is not mythology. This is not national pride dressed up as science. This is what happens when you sequence ancient human remains from burial sites thousands of years old, compare them against the genomes of modern populations, and run the numbers, with the same rigor you would apply to any other empirical question. And when scientists did exactly that, when they extracted DNA from bones dug out of Neolithic graves along the Yellow River, from the people of the Yangshao culture and the Longshan culture and the farmers who grew millet in the bend of that ancient river, what came back was something that stopped researchers in their tracks. The numbers were not what anyone expected. The continuity was not supposed to be this strong. And yet there it was, replicated across study after study, site after site, time period after time period. The match was not approximate. It was not suggestive. It was overwhelming. The genetic ancestry of people living in China's Central Plains today traces back, in the overwhelming majority, to those same Neolithic Yellow River farmers. A 2025 study using what geneticists call the QPADM model, a sophisticated statistical framework for estimating ancestral contributions, found that between 89 and 91% of the ancestry of Central Plains populations comes from Yellow River-related sources. That number has stayed essentially stable across thousands of years of war, migration, dynasty change, and cultural upheaval. The Yellow River Basin was not just the birthplace of Chinese civilization. It was a genetic fortress that time itself could not fully breach. To understand why this is remarkable, you have to understand what happened everywhere else. Genetics has spent the last 2 decades quietly dismantling the romantic idea that most modern peoples are the direct descendants of the ancient civilizations they claim as their heritage. The story in Europe is particularly striking. The people who built Stonehenge were almost entirely replaced by incoming Bronze Age migrants from the Pontic steppe, people whose descendants would later contribute to the genetic makeup of most modern Europeans. Within just a few centuries, the original builders of those great stone monuments had been demographically overwritten to the point of near invisibility. Their monuments survived. Their genes largely did not. The ancient Egyptians of the Pharaonic era share a genetic profile that diverges significantly from modern Egyptians, who carry much higher levels of sub-Saharan African ancestry, reflecting thousands of years of population movement across the continent. The people who built the pyramids, who mummified their pharaohs and developed one of the world's earliest writing systems, do not have direct biological descendants in any dominant sense in the Egypt of today. The Sumerians of ancient Mesopotamia, arguably the world's first literate civilization, the people who invented the wheel and the first system of laws and the earliest form of recorded trade, left almost no direct genetic echo in the people who live in modern day. Iraq. When scientists have systematically compared Chinese DNA against the genetic signatures of these ancient civilizations, the results tell a story that cuts in only one direction. The Yellow River farmers stand apart. They persisted. But let us not get ahead of the science, because the story is not quite as simple as continuity alone. It is more interesting than that. What the ancient DNA record actually reveals when you read it carefully is a story of 2 Chinas, a northern China and a southern China, that were genetically distinct from each other for thousands of years before they began to merge into the complex mosaic that defines Chinese genetic diversity today. This division is not a minor footnote. It is fundamental to understanding everything that follows. Research published in the journal Science, based on genome-wide data from 26 ancient individuals spanning 9,500 years, demonstrated this split in sharp relief. Neolithic northern Chinese individuals, the people of the Yellow River, were genetically closest to modern East Asians, particularly to modern Han Chinese. But ancient individuals from southern China told a completely different story. They were most closely related to modern Southeast Asians and showed a strong genetic affinity to Austronesian populations, the people whose descendants eventually spread across Taiwan, the Philippines, Indonesia, and as far as Madagascar and Hawaii. These were not the same people. They were not even from the same broad genetic family. They spoke different proto-languages, practiced different subsistence strategies, buried their dead in different ways, and carried in their cells the record of different ancestral journeys stretching back tens of thousands of years. And yet, over the millennia that followed, these two worlds came together. The northern Yellow River populations spread southward, mixing with those southern populations, and the result was the genetic landscape of modern China, dominated in its core by Yellow River ancestry, but layered with southern and southeastern Asian contributions that give it depth and complexity. Understanding this merger is one of the central puzzles of Chinese prehistory, and the ancient DNA record is only now giving researchers the tools to begin solving it properly. This southward expansion was not a military conquest in the conventional sense, or at least not always. It was in many ways a demographic expansion driven by something more fundamental than armies: agriculture. The Yellow River farmers had millet. They had organized communities capable of storing food against lean seasons. They had social systems capable of sustaining larger populations and absorbing neighboring groups into their way of life. Farming populations almost always expand at the expense of hunter-gatherer and forager populations, not because farmers are more violent, though they sometimes are, but because they produce more food per unit of land, and more food means more children who survive to adulthood. The mathematics of demographic expansion do not require warfare. They require only that one population be significantly more fertile than another over many generations. The Yellow River millet farmers had that advantage, and over millennia they used it. The 2025 Cell Report study, drawing on whole genome data from 23 individuals dating back 4 to 2,000 years in the Yellow River Bend region, found something particularly striking about the northern frontier. Even at the interface between the Chinese agricultural world and the nomadic pastoralists of the Mongolian steppe, a zone of constant interaction, raiding, intermarriage, and cultural exchange, the Yangshao-related ancestry from the Central Plains remained the dominant genetic component. There were contributions from steppe populations. There were individual outliers who carried ancestry pointing south, toward cultures archaeologists had not expected to find in that region, but the Yellow River core held. Even at the very edges of its world, at the boundary where Chinese farmers faced nomadic horsemen across a landscape of grass and loess, the genetic influence of those ancient farmers proved resilient in ways that resist easy explanation. What makes all of this possible to know, what transforms it from educated guesswork into hard data, is the revolution in ancient DNA analysis that has unfolded over the last decade. For most of human history, once a person died, their genetic story died with them. The DNA in their bones degraded, it fragmented, it was contaminated by soil. Bacteria and fungi in the DNA of anyone who touched the remains in the centuries and millennia that followed. For a long time, scientists believed that ancient DNA from warm, humid climates like China's, as opposed to the frozen permafrost of Siberia or the arid deserts of Central Asia, was simply unrecoverable in any meaningful quantity. That belief turned out to be wrong. Advances in extraction techniques and library preparation methods, in the ability to distinguish genuine ancient human DNA from modern contaminants, opened a window that had seemed permanently closed. Researchers began pulling usable genetic material from teeth and petrous bones, the dense inner ear bone that preserves DNA far better than any other part of the human skeleton, from archaeological sites across China. The data accumulated quickly. New computational tools allowed scientists to reconstruct genome-wide profiles from fragmented and degraded samples that previous generations of researchers would have discarded as unusable. By the mid-2020s, scientists had ancient genomic data from dozens of sites spanning the full sweep of Chinese prehistory, from Paleolithic cave dwellers through Neolithic farmers through Bronze Age and Iron Age populations, and into the historical dynasties. The picture that emerged from all of that data, assembled piece by piece over years of painstaking laboratory work, is the one we are now describing. One of the most significant recent contributions came from a team at Peking University, whose research was published in Nature Communications in September 2025. The study focused on the Baligang site in the northern Yangtze region, a burial site that gave up enough ancient DNA to allow researchers not just to characterize the population, but to trace family relationships within it. What they found was the first direct-away genetic proof of patrilineal social organization in Neolithic China, evidence that people were burying their dead along the male line, that fathers and sons and brothers were interred together in shared graves, that the social structure of these communities 5,000 years ago had already taken on a form deeply recognizable in light of later Chinese cultural patterns. The genetics confirmed what archaeologists had suspected from burial arrangements but could not prove, that Chinese civilization's emphasis on patrilineal descent, on the male line, on the family as a continuous thread running through time, was not an invention of the historical dynasties. It was written into the social structure of the Neolithic itself, encoded in the way people chose to bury their dead thousands of years before Confucius ever wrote a word about filial piety. That same study identified a critical transition point around 4,200 years before the present, a moment when the genetic record at Baligang shows a sudden influx of southern East Asian ancestry. Something happened then. A population moved or expanded or was absorbed. Communities that had been genetically stable for generations suddenly showed new contributions from the south. The composition of the community shifted in ways that are visible in the DNA even today. And this is not an isolated finding. Similar transition markers show up at other sites, other time periods, other regions. The genetic history of China is not a flat line of stasis. It is a record of pulses, of populations spreading and mixing and absorbing, of cultures expanding and contracting, of rivers of human movement flowing and then settling into new configurations. But underneath all of those pulses, the Yellow River signal persists. It bends, it incorporates new contributions, but it does not break. Consider what the data shows for the Eastern Zhou period, that remarkable era from roughly 770 to 221 BCE, when Chinese philosophy, art, and political thought reached heights that would define the civilization for millennia afterward. A 2025 study in Frontiers in Microbiology sequenced ancient genomes from burial sites of this period in the Central Plains, and found that 89 to nearly 92% of the ancestry of those populations derived from Yellow River-related sources. This was the time of Confucius, of Laozi, of Sun Tzu, of the 100 Schools of Thought, an intellectual explosion that produced ideas about governance, ethics, warfare, cosmology, and the nature of reality that are still taught and debated today. And the people living through that intellectual revolution, debating the nature of governance and ethics and the proper relationship between ruler and subject in the courts and academies of the Zhou states. They were, genetically, the direct and largely unbroken. Descendants of the Yangshao millet farmers who had broken ground along the Yellow River 3,000 years before them. The intellectual heritage and the biological heritage ran in parallel, each reinforcing the other across the full span of Chinese history. By the time of the Han Dynasty, the period from which the Han Chinese ethnicity takes its name, the dynasty that consolidated the Chinese Empire and sent ambassadors and trade caravans along the Silk Road to the edges of the known world, the genetic pattern was already ancient. Research into Western Han Dynasty populations from Shandong Province, published in 2025, found that even at the eastern coastal edge of the Han world, populations showed strong genetic continuity with the Middle Neolithic to Iron Age populations of the Middle and Lower Yellow River Basin. Southern rice farming ancestry was present, visible in the data as a minor but real contribution. But the millet farmers of the north had left their mark on the genes of Han Chinese from one end of the empire to the other. The Han Dynasty did not create the Han Chinese genome. It inherited it and carried it forward into the historical era. This brings us back to the comparison that gives this story its full significance. When researchers have taken Chinese ancient DNA and subjected it to the same comparative analyses applied to other ancient civilizations, when they have run the statistical tests that reveal genetic relationships across populations, the results illuminate something unique about the Chinese case. The ancient DNA of Neolithic Egyptians, for example, shows close affinities with populations from the Near East and the Levant. And modern Egyptians carry substantial sub-Saharan African ancestry that was not present in the ancient samples, a testament to thousands of years of population movement across and around the African continent. The ancient Sumerians of Mesopotamia contribute only a partial and heavily diluted signal to modern Middle Eastern populations, their genetic legacy thoroughly transformed by successive waves of migration, conquest, and demographic replacement, stretching from the Bronze Age through the Arab conquests of the 7th century and beyond. Ancient European populations tell perhaps the most dramatic story of replacement of all, with entire founding populations being largely overwritten by successive migrations. First, the Neolithic farmers from Anatolia, who replaced the original European hunter, gatherers, then the Bronze Age steppe pastoralists, whose genetic contribution now dominates most of Europe, and whose expansion also carried the ancestors of Indo-Iranian languages into South Asia. Each of these replacements was so thorough that modern Europeans carry relatively little genetic legacy from the people who inhabited Europe before the Bronze Age. The continuity that Europeans feel with ancient Greece and Rome is primarily cultural, not biological. The genes tell a different story. Against that backdrop, the Yellow River story is almost without parallel in the ancient world. The genetic thread from Neolithic China to modern Han Chinese is not merely traceable, it is dominant. It has not been overwritten. It has not been diluted beyond recognition. It has persisted through the fall of dynasties and the rise of empires. through invasion and famine and plague and the movement of tens of millions of people, through every upheaval that the most turbulent, continuous human history on Earth could produce across 7 millennia. The question that naturally arises, the question that geneticists and archaeologists and historians are now genuinely wrestling with, is why? Why did the Yellow River genetic signature prove so much more durable than the genetic signatures of the ancient Egyptians, the Sumerians, the Bronze Age Europeans? What was different about the Central Plains? Part of the answer is probably demographic scale. From very early in the Neolithic period, the Yellow River farming communities supported populations that were simply large by the standards of the ancient world. The loess soils of the Yellow River Basin, deep, fine-grained soils deposited by winds blowing off the Central Asian interior, were exceptionally fertile and easy to work with early agricultural technology. They produced reliable harvests of millet year after year, and reliable harvests meant population growth. And population growth meant that by the time outside groups began to interact seriously with Yellow River communities, those communities were already massive. Large populations are harder to replace. They absorb incoming migrants and conquerors rather than being absorbed by them. When nomadic groups from the steppe invaded China, as they did repeatedly across thousands of years, from the Xiongnu to the Mongols, they were typically small in number relative to the settled agricultural populations they were conquering. They brought their culture, their language sometimes, their political systems, temporarily, but their genes were a drop in an ocean. The Yellow River genetic pool was simply too vast to be overwritten by any realistic volume of immigration or conquest. But scale alone does not explain everything. There is also the matter of geographical coherence. The fact that the Yellow River Basin and the broader Central Plains region formed a relatively contained agricultural world, bounded to the north by steppe, to the west by desert and mountain, to the south by different ecological zones that supported different populations. This is not a landscape that funnels migratory streams from every direction with equal force. The Yellow River farmers were not sitting at a Mediterranean crossroads where sea trade brought constant new populations from 3 continents. They were sitting in a heartland, and heartlands have a kind of genetic gravity. They pull people in and transform them, rather than being transformed by them. And then there is the social dimension, the very thing that the patrilineal burial evidence points toward. Societies that organize themselves around male line descent, around the family as the primary unit of social identity, around the transmission of land and status and obligation through biological kinship, tend to develop strong mechanisms for maintaining genetic continuity across generations. They track ancestry carefully. They care intensely about who comes from where and who can marry whom. They build institutions, clans, lineages, ancestral halls, genealogical records. They keep the biological and the social tightly coupled in ways that resist the kind of mixing that might otherwise dilute a genetic heritage over time. Chinese civilization developed all of these mechanisms to a degree of elaboration that is arguably unmatched anywhere in the ancient world. The clan system, the ancestral temple, the practice of keeping detailed genealogical records, these are not incidental features of Chinese culture. They are, the genetics now suggests, the cultural expression of something that began in the Neolithic, in the way people chose to bury their fathers alongside their grandfathers along the bends of the Yellow River. None of this is to say that Chinese civilization was genetically isolated or racially pure in any meaningful sense. The data does not support that reading, and the history does not support it either. There was continuous gene flow from southern China throughout the Neolithic and into historical times. There were genetic contributions from steppe populations at the northern frontier that are clearly visible in the data from border regions. There were periods of significant migration and mixing, particularly during the centuries of disunion between the Han and Tang dynasties, when northern China was ruled by a succession of states founded by peoples of steppe origin. The Yangtze River Valley had its own Neolithic farmers, rice-growing peoples whose genetic legacy contributed to the southern Han Chinese profile in ways that are clearly visible in population studies today. The picture is complex and layered and does not reduce to a simple story of stasis. But complexity is not the same as discontinuity, and the Yellow River thread runs through the complexity like a spine runs through a body, present everywhere, defining the overall shape, even when surrounded by other structures. What the latest generation of ancient DNA research has given us, then, is not a simple nationalist narrative of pure and unchanging bloodlines. It has given us something far more interesting and far more scientifically significant, a story of remarkable persistence in the face of constant change. A story of a genetic heritage that bent but did not break, that absorbed and was absorbed, that spread across a continent and seeded populations from the Korean peninsula to the islands of Southeast Asia, but that always retained, in the core of what became Han Chinese identity, the unmistakable signature of those early millet farmers who stood at the bend of the Yellow River and planted the seeds of a civilization that would eventually encompass a quarter of the human race. 7,000 years is a long time. It is longer than the entire span of recorded history. It reaches back before the invention of writing, before bronze metallurgy, before the wheel, before anything that we conventionally associate with the beginning of civilization. The Yangshao culture, whose genetic legacy forms the foundation of modern Han Chinese ancestry, was farming. The Yellow River Basin before the pyramids of Egypt existed, before the Sumerians wrote their first cuneiform tablets in the mud of Mesopotamia, before the Indus Valley civilization raised its remarkably planned cities at Mohenjo-daro and Harappa. These were not primitive people. They were sophisticated farmers and potters and community builders whose painted ceramics rank among the most beautiful objects produced anywhere in the ancient world. And the people alive today who carry their genetic legacy are carrying something that has survived all of that time. Not just the stories passed down through generations, not just the cultural practices and the philosophical traditions and the written characters that Chinese civilization has maintained with its own kind of extraordinary continuity across 4,000 years of recorded history, but the biology itself, the actual molecular record of ancestry that science can now read with a precision that would have seemed like magic to any previous generation of researchers. When a geneticist sequences an ancient tooth from a burial site in Henan province and finds in that degraded fragmentary DNA a clear signal of kinship with a person living in Beijing or Shanghai or Chengdu today, something profound is being demonstrated about the nature of human continuity and the relationship between the past and the present. The 160,000-year ancient DNA study published in 2025, drawing on genomes from across the full temporal sweep of East Asian prehistory, traced the adaptive signatures of East Asian populations through changes in pigmentation, altitude adaptation, and other biological traits, shaped by the specific environments of East Asia across geological timescales. It confirmed that the people of what is now China have been on a long and largely continuous adaptive journey, shaped by the particular demands of the landscapes they inhabited across deep time. That continuity at the population level is matched, in the historical period, by the cultural and genetic continuity of the Yellow River tradition. The two things reinforce each other. The same people who maintain the genetic heritage also maintain the cultural heritage, the language, the script, the philosophical traditions, the social structures. All of these were preserved and transmitted by populations who were themselves, genetically, the heirs of the Neolithic. There are still enormous questions that ancient DNA has not yet answered, and it is important to be honest about the limits of what we currently know, the precise mechanisms by which Yellow River populations spread southward, and when exactly the major pulses of expansion occurred remain subjects of active research and genuine scientific debate. The exact relationship between genetic change and cultural change at specific archaeological transition points, particularly at the Yangshao to Longshan transition, one of the most significant cultural shifts in Chinese prehistory, is still being worked out. The degree to which the early Chinese states of the Bronze Age expanded by incorporating existing populations versus replacing them is a question that requires more ancient DNA from more sites to answer definitively. The nature of the genetic relationship between the populations of the coastal regions, the river valleys, and the interior highlands during the critical formative periods of Chinese civilization is only beginning to come into focus as new sampling fills in the geographical gaps. New data is being generated constantly, new sites are being excavated across China, and the ancient DNA revolution shows no signs of slowing. Each new study adds resolution to a picture that is already remarkable in its broad outlines. New computational techniques are allowing researchers to extract more information from smaller and more degraded samples. The collaboration between Chinese researchers and international genetics teams, sometimes complicated by questions of intellectual property and national sensitivity around ancient human remains, is producing joint publications that pool data and methodologies in ways that benefit the whole field. The map is being filled in, one ancient genome at a time. But the outline is already clear, and the outline is this. Of all the ancient civilizations whose genetic legacy scientists have been able to trace into the modern world, none shows a more direct, more dominant, or more continuous thread than the civilization that grew from the Yellow River Basin. The Egyptians built pyramids that still stand above the desert. The Mesopotamians invented the writing that made complex civilization possible. The Greeks gave the Western world its philosophy and its democratic ideals. The Romans built an empire whose legal and administrative concepts still echo through modern institutions. All of these achievements are real and permanent and worthy of the reverence they receive. But in each of these cases, the people who built those monuments and wrote those texts and debated those ideas have been replaced, in biological terms, by people who are their cultural but not primarily their genetic descendants. The Yellow River farmers built no monuments that have survived the millennia. Their painted pottery survives in museums. Their burial sites survive underground until archaeologists find them. But they did not build in stone on the scale of the Egyptians, and the wooden structures of their communities have long since returned to the earth. What they built instead, what they transmitted across 7,000 years in a form that no amount of conquest or migration or historical upheaval could fully destroy, was the genetic heritage that lives today in the cells of the most numerous ethnic group on earth. They built, in other words, something that outlasted every pyramid and every empire, the biological continuity of a people. If you have Chinese ancestry, you carry that heritage. It is not metaphorical. It is not a matter of cultural identification or national sentiment or the stories your family told you about where you came from. It is the literal molecular truth of your origins, written in the language of adenine and guanine and cytosine and thymine across 3 billion base pairs of DNA that you carry in every cell of your body. And the science now exists to read it. The ancient bones from the Yellow River have been sequenced, the comparisons have been made, the numbers have been checked and rechecked and published in peer-reviewed journals and replicated by independent research teams in multiple countries. The answer is in, and the answer says that something extraordinary has persisted in you, something that was alive, on the banks of the Yellow River before the wheel was invented, before writing was invented, before anything we call civilization had yet begun. It survived everything history could throw at it, and it survives still in you, in this moment, in the extraordinary molecular continuity of the oldest unbroken genetic heritage on Earth.